She pointed at him like he was garbage. In front of every executive in that room, every suit, every title, every person who mattered. Victoria Hart raised one manicured finger and said the words that would change everything. "Get this filthy bastard out of my meeting." The room went dead silent. And Ethan Carter. He didn't beg. He didn't argue. He simply stood up, removed his badge, and said 7 words so quiet, so calm, that nobody in that room would ever forget them. What happened next nearly destroyed a billion-dollar company. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe respect is earned, not given, subscribe. This one's for every man who was ever overlooked. The badge hit the table with a sound so small, so ordinary, that it should have meant nothing. But in that boardroom, in that perfect silence that followed, every single person heard it like a gunshot. Ethan Carter didn't slam it down. He didn't throw it. He set it there the way a man sets down something he's already decided he no longer needs. Deliberately. Finally. Like closing a book you've read 100 times and know by heart. Then he buttoned the top button of his faded work shirt, straightened to his full height, and looked directly at Victoria Hart. "Then pray your company survives without me." He said it quietly. No anger in his voice, no trembling. Just the flat, steady certainty of a man who knows exactly what he's leaving behind, and exactly what it will cost everyone else when he's gone. Then he walked out. Nobody moved. Not the senior engineers with their leather portfolios. Not the department heads in their expensive suits. Not the project managers, the consultants, the vice presidents who had flown in from 3 different states for this meeting. Nobody. They all just watched the door swing shut behind a man in worn-out work boots and a uniform that had seen better days, and for just one moment, even the most important people in that room felt something cold settle in their chests. Something that felt a lot like fear. 3 hours earlier, Ethan Carter had been exactly where he belonged. That's what he always told himself. I belong where I'm needed. And on that Tuesday morning, he was needed 40 feet underground in the facility's primary hydraulic tunnel, crouched beside a junction valve that had been misbehaving for 6 days. He'd been up since 4:30. That wasn't unusual. His daughter Sophie had a habit of climbing into his bed around 3 a.m. She'd done it ever since her mother passed. And even though she fell right back to sleep, Ethan never did. He'd lie there in the dark with her small hand tucked inside his, and just listen to her breathe. Some nights that was enough. Some nights it was the only thing that got him through to morning. By 7, he had her fed, dressed, and dropped at school. By 7:45, he was already in the tunnel. By 8:15, he'd found the problem. It wasn't the valve itself. The valve was fine. It was a pressure regulation discrepancy, 3 nodes upstream, a mismatch between the digital sensor readings and what the physical gauges were actually showing. The kind of thing that could run for weeks without triggering any alarm right up until the moment it catastrophically failed. Ethan had seen it before. He'd seen it in the Thompson line back in 2019 before he corrected the calibration formula and saved the company from a shutdown that would have cost them $11 million in contract penalties. But nobody had officially documented that fix with his name on it. The report that went to the board had credited a senior engineer named Douglas Hale, who hadn't set foot in that tunnel. Ethan knew, Douglas knew, and neither of them had ever said a word about it. One because he was afraid, and one because he had learned a long time ago that fighting for credit cost more energy than it was worth. So he crouched in that tunnel on a Tuesday morning, noted the readings, cross-referenced 3 years of maintenance logs in his head, and started working. His radio crackled at 9:42. "Carter, this is Morrison. You need to get up to conference room B, right now." Dave Morrison was the facilities coordinator. Good man, nervous man, the kind of guy who always delivered bad news with the tone of someone apologizing for someone else's behavior. Ethan frowned at the valve. "I'm in the middle of something, Dave." "I know. But it's look, they're doing the Meridian walkthrough upstairs, the big contract meeting. And there's something in the production specs that Hendricks flagged, and he's asking for you specifically. Tom Hendricks, lead structural engineer. 22 years with the company, the kind of man who wore the same brand of flannel shirt every day and treated every problem like a math equation that just hadn't been solved yet. If Hendricks was asking for Ethan by name in a meeting like that, it meant something was genuinely wrong. Ethan set down his wrench. Give me 10 minutes to secure this junction. They want you now, Ethan. He closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he stood up, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and started climbing. He could hear the meeting before he reached the door. Bond Conference Room B was the big one, floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, a table long enough to seat 30, the kind of room the company used when they needed to impress someone. Through the glass, Ethan could see the full assembly engineers, executives, department heads, and at the far end of the table, 4 people he didn't recognize in very expensive suits. The Meridian Group, the aerospace client whose contract represented somewhere north of $40 million in revenue, and more importantly, enough work to keep 800 people employed for the next 4 years. Standing at the head of the table was Victoria Hart. She had been CEO for 11 weeks. Ethan knew her only by reputation, and by the single time he had passed her in the hallway on her second day, when she had looked straight through him, the way people look through furniture. She was tall, polished, the kind of person who commanded a room simply by existing in it. She had a Harvard MBA background in finance, and a turnaround story at a manufacturing firm in Ohio that the company's board had spent 2 months discussing before hiring her. She was by every measure the board cared about exactly the right choice. She had no engineering background whatsoever. Ethan pushed open the door. Every head in the room turned. He was aware of how he looked. He was always aware of how he looked in rooms like this one. The worn uniform, the calloused hands, the faint smell of machine oil that never quite washed out, no matter how many times he scrubbed. He was aware of the way certain people's eyes moved over him, the way you scan a word you don't recognize and then skip past it. Tom Hendricks stood up immediately. Ethan, good, come in. He was already moving toward the production schematics spread across the side table, pointing to a section Ethan could see from 20 feet away. We've got a problem with the load-bearing calculation in the Meridian frame sequence, Hendricks said, lowering his voice, even though the whole room was watching. The stress distribution in the primary mounting points, it's not matching the field tolerances. I've been through it 3 times, and I keep coming back to the same place. Walk me through your assessment of the Junction 7 variance. Ethan moved to the schematic. He looked at it for perhaps 15 seconds. This isn't a calculation problem, he said. The tolerances are right. The issue is the material specification. Whoever signed off on the secondary alloy substitution in February didn't account for the thermal expansion differential at operational altitude. Over time, under load cycling, you'll get microfracturing in the mounting flange. Not immediately, but it will happen. The room was very quiet. One of the Meridian executives, a woman with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, leaned slightly forward. How long before structural failure? At current production rates, 12 to 18 months after installation, maybe less depending on the operational environment. The room erupted. People talking over each other. Someone reaching for a phone. 2 engineers pulling up data on laptops simultaneously. The Meridian team exchanging sharp looks that said very clearly, "We are not signing anything today." Ethan was still studying the schematic when he heard her voice. Who is this person? He looked up.
Bound to me,
Victoria Hart was standing at the head of the table, and she was looking at him the way he had seen certain people look at a stray dog that had wandered onto their property. Not with cruelty exactly, with a particular kind of contemptuous impatience. The kind that doesn't even bother to get angry, because the thing it's looking at is simply too beneath notice to warrant real emotion. Victoria, this is Ethan Carter, Hendricks said carefully. I can see what he is. Her eyes moved over Ethan's uniform. Why is a maintenance worker in this meeting? Because he just identified a problem that could have Tom. Her voice was flat, final. The voice of someone who does not repeat herself. This is a senior executive meeting with our most important client. It is not the appropriate venue for... She paused, and the pause itself was its own kind of statement for this. Ethan said evenly, "The problem I just described is real, Ms. Hart. If you move forward with the current production spec..." "I wasn't speaking to you." She looked at the man standing to her left. Gerald Pierce, head of security, who had been with the company for 20 years, and who Ethan had had coffee with on approximately 300 mornings. Gerald was looking at the table. "Gerald, please have this man removed." Gerald didn't move. The room was absolutely still. Ethan watched Gerald's jaw tighten. He watched the small private war happening behind the man's eyes. And he felt something that wasn't quite sadness. Something older than sadness. Something he'd carried for a long time now settle quietly in his chest. Victoria Hart turned her gaze back to the room and she raised one hand, the gesture of someone who is very used to having their instructions carried out, and pointed at the door. "Get this filthy bastard out of my meeting." Later, people who were in that room would describe the silence that followed in different ways. Some said it was the kind of quiet that happens after a car accident. Some said it felt like the moment before a storm breaks when the air pressure changes and every animal within a mile radius goes still. One of the junior engineers, a 24-year-old named Marcus Webb, who had been with the company for less than a year, would later say that it was the most uncomfortable he had ever been in his professional life, and that he had spent the entire silence staring at his hands because he could not bring himself to look at the man standing at the side table. Ethan didn't look at any of them. He looked at the schematic for a long moment. Then he looked at Tom Hendricks, who had gone the color of old chalk. Then he looked at the Meridian executives who were watching him with an expression that he would later realize was not contempt or dismissal. It was recognition. He reached into his shirt pocket, removed his employee badge, the one with his photo, his name, his access level. The little scratch on the bottom left corner from the time he dropped it on the machine floor in 2021. He held it for a moment. He thought about the 4:30 mornings. He thought about Sophie's hand inside his. He thought about every problem he had solved in the dark in the tunnels in the underbelly of this building, while the people in rooms like this one took the credit and moved on to the next meeting. He set the badge on the table. The sound it made was very small. And in the perfect silence of that room, it was the loudest thing anyone had heard in years. He buttoned the top button of his shirt, straightened his spine, and he looked at Victoria Hart, not with anger, not with desperation, with the calm, unshakable certainty of a man who has just made a decision and will not be walking it back. "Then pray your company survives without me." He turned. He walked to the door. He pushed it open. And he didn't look back. Outside in the corridor, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead the same way they always did. Ethan walked past the coffee station where he and Gerald had shared 1,000 quiet mornings. Past the bulletin board with its yellowed safety notices. Past the elevator he rarely used because the stairs were faster. He pushed through the exterior door into the October air, and he stood there for a moment on the concrete steps with the cold finding the back of his neck and the sound of the city running underneath everything like a current. His phone showed 10:17 a.m. Sophie's school let out at 3:15. He had time. He descended the steps, turned left, and started walking. He didn't call anyone, didn't stop to explain, didn't sit in his truck and talk himself in or out of anything. He just walked. And 3 blocks away, without breaking stride, he allowed himself one thing, one small, quiet thing that he would never have let himself do inside that building. He pressed the back of his wrist against his eyes. Held it there for 3 seconds. Then put his hand back in his pocket and kept walking. In conference room B, the silence lasted 11 seconds after the door swung shut. Then Gerald Pierce quietly picked up Ethan's badge from the table. He looked at it for a moment, turned it over once in his hands, and then he set it down again very carefully in the center of the table where everyone could see it. Nobody reached for it. Victoria Hart was already moving forward, redirecting the conversation, reclaiming the energy of the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who does not allow disruptions to cost her momentum. But something had shifted. Why? It was subtle, invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. But Tom Hendricks felt it. So did Marcus Webb. So did the woman from the Meridian Group, who had pushed her reading glasses back down onto her nose and was now looking at the empty doorway with an expression that her colleagues couldn't quite read. She had been in this industry for 31 years. She had seen a lot of things in rooms like this one. She had never seen a maintenance worker set down his badge and walk out of a meeting like a man who knew exactly what he was worth. And she had never, not once in 31 years, seen every engineer in the room go pale at exactly the same moment. She uncapped her pen, made a small note on the legal pad in front of her. Find out who that man was. That evening, Ethan made spaghetti. It was Sophie's favorite, which meant it appeared on their table approximately twice a week, regardless of how Ethan felt about it. He stood at the stove and stirred the sauce, while she sat at the kitchen table behind him, doing her reading homework. Her small voice working through the words one by one, occasionally asking how to pronounce something, and he would tell her without turning around, because he had learned to cook and help with homework simultaneously a long time ago. Dad. Did something happen today? He turned then. She was 7. She had her mother's eyes, the particular shade of gray that changed depending on the light, and her mother's unsettling habit of reading people the way other people read books. What makes you ask that? She shrugged one shoulder. You stirred the pasta so long it's gonna be mushy. He looked down at the pot. She wasn't wrong. He took the pasta off the heat and drained it, and he said as casually as he could manage, I had a disagreement with someone at work. What kind of disagreement? The kind where I decided I was done. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her thinking. Are you fired? No bug. I quit. Another pause. He set the pasta on the table and went back for the sauce. Is that good or bad? He sat down across from her. He thought about the junction valve still waiting in the tunnel. He thought about the Meridian schematics. He thought about 12 to 18 months and microfracturing and 800 people who went home to their families every evening, not knowing how close certain things could come to falling apart. He thought about Victoria Hart's voice. Filthy bastard. I don't know yet, he said honestly. Sophie studied him with those gray eyes for another moment. Then she picked up her fork. Okay, she said. And she started eating. That was the thing about Sophie. She didn't push. She didn't spiral. She had learned the way children of loss learn quietly, and too early that some things couldn't be resolved at a dinner table, and that sometimes the most important thing you could do for someone was simply sit down and eat with them. Ethan watched his daughter eat her spaghetti and felt something in his chest that was too large and too complicated to name. He picked up his fork, and he ate. He couldn't sleep that night. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the particular quality of the wakefulness, not the quiet drifting kind, but the kind with edges, the kind that came from something unfinished, pressing against the inside of your mind. He lay in the dark and ran through the schematics in his head. The alloy substitution, the thermal expansion differential, the junction 7 variants. He knew what would happen. He knew because he had been watching this building and its systems for 11 years, and because he understood in the way that certain people understand certain things down in their bones exactly how the pieces connected. The crisis wouldn't be immediate. There would be a period of confusion first. Problems that didn't seem related to each other. Solutions that almost worked, but not quite. And then gradually the realization. He tried to tell himself it wasn't his problem anymore. He tried it several times. In the next room, Sophie made a small sound in her sleep and then was quiet. Ethan stared at the ceiling. Pray your company survives without me. He had meant it as a statement of fact, not a curse. He wasn't a man who wished failure on anyone. What he had wanted in that moment, in the only way available to him, was simply to tell the truth. The truth was, things would go wrong, and for the first time in 11 years, it would not be his problem to fix them. He closed his eyes. It is not your problem. He told himself that until something close to sleep finally came. He did not entirely believe it. The first call came at 6:47 in the morning. Ethan was standing at the kitchen counter with a mug of coffee, watching Sophie work through a bowl of cereal with the focused intensity she brought to everything when his phone buzzed against the counter. He glanced at the screen. Dave Morrison. He set the phone face down and finished his coffee. The second call came 4 minutes later. Same number. The third came while he was helping Sophie find her left shoe, which had somehow ended up underneath the bathroom sink. He silenced it without looking. By the time he dropped Sophie at school and turned back toward the house, he had 7 missed calls. 4 from Dave, 2 from Tom Hendricks, 1 from a number he didn't recognize. He drove home, made a second cup of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table. He did not call any of them back. No. This was not cruelty. Ethan Carter was not built for cruelty. What it was, he told himself, was clarity. He had said what he said. He had walked out that door. A man who meant it didn't turn around 2 days later because things got uncomfortable. He opened his laptop and pulled up the online job board he hadn't looked at in years. He stared at it for a long time. Then he closed the laptop. Then he opened it again. He was still sitting there an hour later when his phone rang for the 12th time, and this time because the number was Sophie's school, he answered it immediately. It was not the school. Ethan. The voice was Tom Hendricks. Low, careful, the voice of a man choosing words the way you step across ice. I know you're not taking calls. I understand. I just need 2 minutes. Ethan leaned back in his chair. How did you get this number? You've had the same cell number for 11 years, and you've called my desk approximately 400 times. I know it by heart. A pause. 2 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Talk. Something's wrong with line 4. Hendricks said it the way doctors say the thing they've been building up to telling you. Directly. No softening. The torque calibration on the assembly sequence started throwing errors this morning. Mitchell and Park have been on it since 5 a.m. They can't isolate it. Did they check the feedback loop in the secondary sensor array? A short silence. What? The feedback loop in the secondary sensor array. There's a 7 millisecond lag that compounds when the torque sequence cycles above 40%. I rerouted the signal path in March to compensate, but it requires a manual reset every 90 days. Last reset was in July. Ethan paused. It was due 2 weeks ago. He heard Hendricks exhale, then quietly, How do you know that from memory? Because I'm the one who set it up. Another pause. Tell Mitchell to pull up maintenance log M1147, the reset procedures documented in the addendum. Ethan. 2 minutes. Ethan said. You said 2 minutes, Tom. He ended the call. He sat very still for a moment, then he pulled his laptop toward him again, opened the job board, and started scrolling. He was going to be fine. He told himself that. He was going to be completely fine. He just needed to find something else, and then he would be fine. By noon, the missed calls had reached 23. He stopped counting after that. The problem spread faster than anyone had anticipated, and the people who were supposed to contain it did not understand what they were dealing with. That was the brutal, simple truth of it. The engineers on the floor were competent. Some of them were very good, but competence in a system requires understanding how the system was actually built, not just how it was supposed to work on paper. And the gap between those two things in this facility was enormous. Because Ethan Carter had been filling that gap for 11 years, quietly, invisibly, in the hours between his official duties and his unofficial ones, and nobody had ever bothered to document what he actually did, because nobody had ever looked closely enough to see it. By 2 in the afternoon, Line 4 was down completely. By 3, Line 7 was showing instability. By the time Ethan picked Sophie up from school at 3:15, the facility was operating at 62% capacity and declining. "You seem less sad today," Sophie announced from the back seat. "I'm not sad." "Yesterday you were sad, you just didn't say it." He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "How do you know the difference? When you're actually fine, you hum when you cook. Yesterday you didn't hum." He thought about this. "I'll try to hum more." "That's not how it works, Dad." He almost smiled. Sophie had a way of landing the absolute truth of something and then moving on to the next topic without any ceremony, the way certain people move through a room efficiently without snagging on anything. Her mother had been the same way. "Can we stop for ice cream?" "It's 40 degrees out. Ice cream doesn't have a temperature requirement." He stopped for ice cream. They sat in the truck in the parking lot of the little shop on Callaway Street, and Ethan had a black coffee, and Sophie had something involving 3 kinds of sprinkles, and for 20 minutes the world was exactly small enough to manage. Just the truck cab and the coffee, and his daughter, explaining to him with great seriousness why mint chocolate chip was objectively superior to every other flavor, and the way the afternoon light came through the windshield and sat on her hair. Yay. He thought, "I can make this work. Whatever comes next, I can make it work." His phone buzzed on the dashboard. He didn't look at it. It buzzed again, and again. And then it began ringing continuously, one call rolling into the next, like something frantic was trying to break through. Sophie looked at the phone, then at him. "You should probably answer that." "I'm having ice cream with my daughter." "Dad." She said it the way adults say it to other adults. "Answer the phone." He picked it up. Not Hendricks this time. Not Morrison. The number on the screen was one he recognized from the company directory, the executive suite's direct line. He stared at it through 2 more rings. He answered. "Mr. Carter?" Victoria Hart's voice. Measured, controlled, but with something underneath it now that hadn't been there in that boardroom. Something pressed flat and tightly contained. "I need to speak with you." "Ms. Hart." Then a pause. He could almost hear her recalibrating. He suspected Victoria Hart was not a woman who made this kind of call often. "We're experiencing some production difficulties." "I heard." "Our engineering team is there working to resolve it, but the timeline is..." Another pause. Shorter. She was choosing between 2 versions of this conversation, and choosing quickly. "It's not going the way we need it to go." Ethan looked out the windshield. A woman was walking a dog on the sidewalk. A kid on a bicycle. Normal afternoon. Normal world. "I'm sorry to hear that." Silence on the line. Then, "Mr. Carter, I'm asking you to come in." "I don't work there anymore, Ms. Hart." "I'm aware of that. I'm asking you." The sentence stopped. Restarted. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to consult. I appreciate the call." He meant it, actually. He understood how much it cost her to make it. "I'll have to think about it." He ended the call. Sophie was watching him over her cup of 3-flavor sprinkle disaster. Was that work? Sort of. Are they in trouble? He looked at his daughter, 7 years old. gray eyes that saw everything. Yeah, Bug, they are. She licked her spoon, considered. Are you going to help them? Ethan didn't answer right away. She didn't push, just waited the way she always waited, the way she'd learned to give him space for the things that took longer to come out. I don't know yet, he said finally. Sophie nodded. Okay. She went back to her ice cream. Then, without looking up, Mom would have helped them. The words landed softly the way Sophie always delivered the most important things. Not as an accusation, not as pressure, just as a fact about a woman they both loved. Ethan looked at his coffee. Yeah, he said quietly. She would have. He drove them home, made dinner, helped with homework. Read half a chapter of the book they were working through together, an adventure story about a boy and a mechanical dog, and a world that had gone sideways in interesting ways. Sophie fell asleep with her cheek on his arm, and he sat there for a while after in the quiet before carrying her to her bed. Then he went to the kitchen table, opened his laptop, and started pulling up everything he knew about the current production system. Not because he'd made a decision. He told himself that. He was just thinking, organizing, working through it the way he worked through everything systematically, because his brain didn't know how to let a problem sit unresolved without at least mapping its edges. He worked until 2 in the morning. The calls resumed the next day at dawn. This time there were new voices. A name he didn't recognize, someone from the board he thought based on the area code. 2 more from Hendricks, 1 from Gerald Pierce, which surprised him because Gerald Pierce was not someone who made personal calls. He listened to that voicemail twice. Ethan, it's Gerald. I know you don't owe this place anything. I know that better than most, considering... A pause. Gerald wasn't a man who paused often. Considering what happened in that room, people are scared down here, man. Real scared. I've got guys on the floor who are talking about layoffs. They've got families. I don't know what else to say. You know I wouldn't call if it wasn't just call me back. Please. Ethan sat with that message for a long time. He thought about the guys on the floor. He knew their names. He knew their kids' ages and their coffee orders and the particular ways they each went quiet when something was worrying them. He'd spent 11 years working alongside them in the parts of the building that nobody else thought about, in the early mornings and the late nights, and the moments between moments where the real work got done. He thought about 800 people going home to their families. Holy. He thought about Sophie's voice. Mom would have helped them. He thought about the meridian schematics, the alloy substitution, 12 to 18 months. He called Hendricks. Tell me what's actually happening, he said without any preamble. Hendricks didn't miss a beat. Line 4 is down. Line 7 is intermittent. We're getting about 40% reliability. Lines 2 and 8 are nominal, but I don't trust it. I think there's a systemic issue that we're not seeing because we don't know what we're looking at. The Meridian Group has formally delayed signing. They're not gone yet, but their lead rep called Victoria this morning, and Ethan, her exact words were, "We have concerns about operational competency. $43 million is sitting on a knife edge. Who's running the floor troubleshooting? Mitchell's leading it. He's good, but he's been here 3 years. He doesn't have the system history." Ethan was already pulling up his laptop. The Line 7 issue is almost certainly the encoder calibration in the secondary drive shaft assembly. There was a firmware update pushed in September that altered the response threshold, and nobody recalibrated the physical tolerances to match. It's been running out of spec for 6 weeks. Was a long silence. How do you know about a firmware update from September? You had no reason to be anywhere near that system. I know, because Jimmy Reyes called me at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night when the update started throwing errors, and nobody from IT was reachable, and I walked him through the temporary patch over the phone, because that's what I do, Tom. That's what I've always done. His voice was even, not bitter, just precise. Is it in the log? Another silence. Longer. No, Hendricks said quietly. It's not in any log. It never is. The words sat between them for a moment, holding everything they contained. Ethan. Hendrix's voice was different now. Careful in a new way, not the carefulness of a man managing a difficult situation, but the carefulness of a man who has just understood something he should have understood a long time ago. How many times has this happened? How many problems? Tom. Ethan stopped him, not harshly. Not right now. One thing at a time. Right. Okay. What do we do about line 7? Tell Mitchell to pull the encoder unit on shaft assembly 3 and 4 and run a manual tolerance check against the pre-September baseline spec. The numbers are in maintenance file E-0892. It's going to take about 4 hours if they do it right. Don't let them rush it. He could hear Hendrix already moving, already relaying the information. Then the engineer came back on the line. What about line 4? That one's more complicated. Ethan pulled up a set of notes he'd been building in the dark of his kitchen for the past 2 nights. The root cause isn't in line 4 itself, it's upstream. Pressure regulation in the junction 9 manifold. It's been underperforming for about 3 months. I filed a maintenance request in August and it was deferred twice. Eventually I handled it myself, but the fix I implemented was temporary. I was planning to do the permanent repair in November. He paused. That repair never happened. Silence. What do you need to fix it permanently? Access to the manifold room, about 6 hours, and someone who actually knows what they're doing handling the secondary bypass while I work on the primary. Jimmy Reyes is the right person for that. A very long silence this time. Ethan, Hendrix said carefully, does this mean you're coming in? Ethan looked around the kitchen. The breakfast dishes still in the drying rack. Sophie's drawing on the refrigerator a crayon version of him and her, standing in front of a house with a very large yellow sun. The coffee mug with the chipped handle that he kept using anyway because she had given it to him for Father's Day 2 years ago, and he couldn't bring himself to throw it out. I haven't decided anything yet, he said. I'm giving you information. What you do with it is your business. He ended the call. He sat for a moment. Then he opened his maintenance files, the real ones, the ones he kept on his personal laptop because he'd long since stopped trusting the company's documentation system to hold anything accurately, and he began organizing everything into a single coherent document. Just in case, he told himself. Just so someone has it if it comes to that. He was 40 pages in when his doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone. He went to the door, opened it, and found Emily Brooks standing on his front step. He knew Emily by sight, a project coordinator mid-30s, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of person who was always slightly more alert than everyone else in the room. They had spoken maybe 4 times in passing. He didn't know why she was on his doorstep. Mr. Carter, she said. She was holding a folder, and she looked like someone who had not slept in 2 days. I'm sorry to come to your home. I didn't know how else to reach you. You could have called. You weren't answering calls from the company. How did you get my address? HR directory. She hesitated. I know this is an overstep. I understand if you want me to leave, but I need to show you something, and I think you need to see it before you make any decisions. Ethan looked at her, then at the folder, then back at her. Come in. He put coffee on. She sat at the kitchen table and opened the folder, and what she spread out in front of him changed the temperature of the room. It was documentation. Company documentation, some of it going back 8 years. Patent filings, innovation reports, engineering citations, award submissions. All of it related to technical solutions, process improvements, design corrections that had saved the company significant money. And in every single one of them, Ethan's name had been removed. Replaced in most cases with the name of Douglas Hale. I found the first one by accident, Emily said. Her voice was controlled, but her hands were not entirely steady. I was working on the Meridian compliance documentation, and I needed to cross-reference the 2021 hydraulic system redesign. I pulled the original work order and the final patent submission, and they didn't match. Different author attribution. So I pulled another one, and another one. She looked at him. How long has this been going on? Ethan looked at the documents for a long time. A while, he said. How many of these are yours? He was quiet. Mr. Carter. Her voice was very steady now. The steadiness of someone who has decided that the truth is more important than comfort. How many of these solutions did you create? He turned over one of the patent filings, read the attribution line, set it down, turned over another one. Most of them, he said. That's. Emily closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them and looked at him with the expression of someone who had suspected a thing and now had to live with the confirmation. Douglas Hale has been with the company for 12 years, she said. He's been credited with innovations worth. She checked her notes. Somewhere in the range of $8 to $12 million in process savings and intellectual property. He's been promoted 3 times based on that record. He's currently drawing a senior engineering salary of. I know what Douglas makes, Ethan said quietly. I've watched him get every one of those promotions. Did you know he was taking credit for your work? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed on the street. The refrigerator hummed. I knew, he said. And you didn't say anything. He looked at her. It was not a hostile look. It was the look of a man deciding how much truth a person can hold at one time. I'm a maintenance technician with a high school diploma, Ms. Brooks. Douglas Hale has 2 engineering degrees and 15 years of professional credibility. If I had accused him, what do you think would have happened? She didn't answer. Because they both knew the answer. I stayed because the work mattered, he said. The problems were real. The solutions were real. People's jobs depended on those systems running right. I couldn't walk away from that because someone else was putting their name on the paperwork. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she gathered the documents, carefully organized them, and slid them across the table toward him. These are copies, she said. I have the original secured somewhere that isn't the company server. She paused. I've also sent copies to a third party, just in case anything happens to either set. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You've been busy. I've been awake for 41 hours, she corrected. That's different. She stood. I don't know what you're going to do. I don't know what I'm going to do yet either. But I needed you to see this. Because whatever you decide, whether you go back, whether you don't, you should decide it knowing the full picture. She picked up her bag. At the kitchen doorway, she stopped. Mr. Carter. She turned back. That firmware issue on line 7, the one from September. Is there a way to fix it without you being on site? He studied her. You've been talking to Hendricks. I've been talking to everyone, trying to understand what the company is actually looking at. And he nodded slowly. Tell Mitchell to pull encoder units 3 and 4. Manual tolerance check against maintenance file. E-0892. He watched her write it down. Tell him not to rush the recalibration. 4 hours minimum done right. She finished writing, looked up. Thank you. Ms. Brooks. She paused. When this is over, however it ends, those documents matter. Not just for me. For anyone else this was happening to who couldn't prove it. She held his gaze. I know, she said quietly. Then she was gone. Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table with the copied documents spread out in front of him. He looked at them for a long time. Patent after patent. Solution after solution. 11 years of his best thinking. His hardest work. His most careful problem solving. All of it there in black and white, all of it carrying someone else's name. He felt something move through him that wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was older and heavier than anger. It was the feeling of a man who has known a truth for a very long time, and has finally seen it written down in a language that the rest of the world could read. His phone buzzed. Text from a number he didn't recognize, short, 5 words. This is the Meridian Group. He picked up the phone. We'd like to speak with you directly, tonight if possible, not through the company. Ethan read it twice, set the phone face down on the table, picked it up again. He thought about $43 million on a knife edge. He thought about 800 jobs. He thought about Jimmy Reyes calling him on a Saturday night. He thought about Gerald Pierce's voice on a voicemail. Real scared, man. Real scared. He thought about Sophie's face in the truck. Mom would have helped them. He stood up from the table. He went to the closet where he kept his work gear, and he stood there looking at it for a long moment. The spare uniform, the toolkit, the worn-out boots he hadn't touched in 2 days. He didn't take any of it. Not yet. He picked up his phone and typed one line back to the Meridian number. Send me a time and a location. He set the phone down, stood in the quiet of his kitchen. Whatever came next, he told himself he was going to go into it with his eyes completely open. No more invisible. No more swallowed. Whatever he did from this point forward, he was going to do it standing in the full light of what he knew, what he had built, and what he was worth. He went to the refrigerator and looked at Sophie's crayon drawing. The two figures in front of the house. The enormous yellow sun. He touched the edge of it lightly with one finger. Then he went to get ready. The Meridian Group's representative met him at a coffee shop 12 blocks from the facility. Her name was Catherine Voss. Ethan recognized her. She had been sitting at the far end of the table during the meeting, the one with the reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, the one who had made a note on her legal pad when he walked out. In person, she was smaller than he remembered, but her eyes were exactly the same. Sharp. Patient. The eyes of someone who had spent 30 years in a room full of people trying to obscure the truth and had gotten very good at finding it anyway. She was already seated when he arrived, coffee in front of her, a second cup across the table that she pushed toward him when he sat down. I took a guess, she said. Black. That's right. He wrapped both hands around the mug. How'd you know? Men who work with their hands usually take it black. Men who work behind desks usually need something in it. She said it without judgment, just as observation. Thank you for coming. You said you wanted to talk directly. I'm here. He looked at her. What does that mean directly? It means not through Victoria Hart, not through the company's legal team, not through anyone whose interest is in managing the story rather than understanding the situation. She folded her hands on the table. Mr. Carter, in 31 years in aerospace procurement, I have sat across from a lot of people who claim to have identified critical system flaws. Most of them were right about the problem and wrong about the severity. Some of them were wrong about both. She paused. What you described in that meeting 2 days ago, the thermal expansion differential, the microfracturing timeline, that was not the language of someone who had skimmed a report. That was someone who had lived inside that system. I have, Ethan said, for 11 years. Tell me about the alloy substitution. So he did. He laid it out the way he always laid things out, clearly, without performance, starting at the root and working forward. The February substitution. The specification that hadn't been properly vetted for operational altitude stress. The load cycling math. The 18-month failure window that was now, with 2 months already elapsed, sitting at 16. Catherine Voss listened without interrupting. She didn't write anything down. She just listened with the full, undivided attention of someone who understood exactly what she was hearing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. We have 12 components from your facility already integrated into a test platform, she said. If what you're describing is accurate, those components are compromised. They are. Can it be corrected? At the component level, yes. It requires pulling the mounting flanges and replacing them with the correct alloy spec before installation. It's a significant rework, but it's manageable. Once they're in the air. He paused. Different conversation. Catherine nodded slowly. And the company's current engineering team, are they capable of executing that rework correctly? Wow. Ethan thought about Mitchell. About the Line 7 encoder issue. About the 41 hours Emily had spent awake trying to understand what she was looking at. They're capable, he said carefully. but they'd need detailed guidance on the specific rework protocol. There are tolerances in the flange replacement that aren't obvious from the spec sheet. Would you be willing to provide that guidance? He looked at his coffee. That depends. On what? On a few things I'm still working out. Catherine Voss studied him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, Mr. Carter, I've been doing this a long time. I know what it looks like when a company is held together by one person who nobody's bothered to look at carefully. She paused. I also know what it costs that person. Ethan didn't say anything. Whatever you decide, she said. I want you to know that the Meridian Group's concerns extend beyond the contract. We have a vested interest in understanding how a systemic flaw of this magnitude went undetected and unreported for this long. She let that sit. We'll be conducting our own independent review, and we will be asking questions about attribution. That word, attribution. He felt something move through him. How much do you know? Enough to know there are more questions than we've been given answers to. She picked up her coffee cup. Emily Brooks contacted us this morning. Ethan set down his mug. She sent documentation, Catherine continued. We've had our legal team review it. What they found. She stopped. Chose her next words very deliberately. It was significant. The word significant landed in his chest like a stone dropping into still water. I'm going to ask you something directly, Catherine said. And I'm asking because the answer changes what happens next. She looked at him steadily. How many of the technical innovations credited to Douglas Hale in the past 8 years were originally your work? The coffee shop moved around them. A cup clinked somewhere behind him. Someone laughed at the counter. Ethan said most of them. Catherine closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them, something had settled in her expression. A kind of grim, unsurprised clarity. I see. Does that change things? Yes, she said simply. It changes quite a lot. She stood, offered her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm and direct, the handshake of someone who meant exactly what they said, and nothing more. We'll be in touch, Mr. Carter. Probably sooner than you think. He drove home. Sat in the truck in front of his house for a moment before going inside. The street was quiet. A neighbor was raking leaves. Somewhere up the block, a kid was on a bicycle. He sat there, and he thought about the word attribution, and what it was going to break open when it finally hit the surface. Sophie was at his sister's place for the evening, Ethan's sister Carol, who lived 20 minutes away, and had been the primary reason Ethan had been able to hold his work schedule together since his wife passed. He had an empty house, which he almost never had, and he found that he didn't quite know what to do with it. He went inside, made coffee he didn't drink, stood in the kitchen for a while. His phone rang at 8:14 p.m. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Mr. Carter. Not a voice he recognized. Male, older, precise. My name is Richard Alderman. I'm the chairman of the board. Ethan sat down. I understand you've spoken with Tom Hendricks, with Emily Brooks, and this evening with Catherine Voss from the Meridian Group. Not a question. A statement of facts organized to demonstrate that he knew the shape of things. I'm calling because I'd like to speak with you before the situation develops any further. What situation are we talking about, Mr. Alderman? I think you know. A brief pause. We've become aware of certain documentation irregularities. Emily Brooks filed a formal report with our compliance office this afternoon. Another pause. This one longer. What she filed was substantial. Ethan didn't fill the silence. He had learned long ago that the person who fills silence usually gives more ground than they intended to. I owe you an apology, Alderman said. Of all the things Ethan had been prepared for in this conversation, that was not among them. He said nothing. Not just for what happened in that meeting room, Alderman continued. For 11 years of institutional failure. For a system that took what you built and gave someone else the credit, and for my not having looked closely enough to see it. His voice was measured, but it had weight behind it. Real weight. That's a failure of governance, and I'm not going to minimize it. Okay, Ethan said. I need to ask you something, and I want you to understand that your answer will not affect any decisions regarding the documentation irregularities. That process is already in motion, and it will proceed regardless. He paused. Will you come back? Not permanently. Not under the old terms, under new terms that we'll negotiate properly. But we need you in that building. We need your eyes on the Line 4 junction and the Meridian component rework. The company is... The chairman of the board paused, and in that pause, Ethan heard something he had never expected to hear from anyone at that level. He heard the edge of real fear. We're in trouble, Mr. Carter. Real trouble. Ethan was quiet for a long time. I'll come in tomorrow morning, he said. But I'm not an employee. I'm not a consultant on the company's terms. I'll define my own terms, and you'll either accept them or you won't. That's fair. And I want to speak with Victoria Hart, before I touch a single system, face to face. A pause. I'll arrange it. First thing tomorrow. I'll make it happen. Ethan ended the call. He sat in the quiet of his kitchen. He thought about tomorrow morning. He thought about walking back into that building. He thought about the face Victoria Hart would make when she had to sit across from the man she'd thrown out of her meeting. He thought about Douglas Hale. He hadn't let himself think too directly about Douglas until now. It was easier to hold the abstract stolen credit erased documentation than to think about the specific man who had looked him in the eye on hundreds of ordinary mornings. Drunk coffee beside him at the station, clapped him on the shoulder after a particularly hard shift, and taken everything he built. Ethan had known. That was the part nobody would understand that he had known, and he had swallowed it, and he had kept working anyway. Because the alternative was a fight he couldn't win. Because he had a daughter to feed, and a mortgage, and because some battles look unwinnable from the ground, even when they're not, and he had been standing on the ground for 11 years looking up. He went to bed at 10, lay awake until midnight. At 12:15 his phone buzzed with a text from an unsaved number. He looked at it. It's Douglas. I know what's happening. I need to talk to you before tomorrow, please. Ethan stared at the message for a long time. Then he put the phone face down on the nightstand. He was up at 4:30. Not because Sophie climbed into bed she wasn't home, but because that's when his body woke up regardless. He made coffee, sat with it, went through everything he needed to say, and in what order. He showered, ironed a shirt, not his work uniform. A regular shirt, dark blue, the one he wore to parent-teacher conferences, and the occasional church service he made it to. He looked at himself in the mirror for a moment. A 35-year-old man with calloused hands and a face that had taken some weather. He looked like what he was. He decided that was exactly right. He picked Sophie up from Carol's place at 7, dropped her at school, and drove to the facility. He hadn't called ahead to confirm his arrival. He figured they'd know he was coming, or they wouldn't. He pulled into the parking lot at 7:43 a.m., walked through the front entrance, an entrance he had used thousands of times, but never through the front door, always through the side access, and told the receptionist he was there to see Victoria Hart. The receptionist looked at him. Looked at her computer, looked back at him. And your name? Ethan Carter. Something crossed her face. Recognition, maybe. Or the particular expression of someone who has heard a name mentioned in tense, urgent voices many times in the past 48 hours. She picked up her phone. He waited, standing. He didn't sit. Gerald Pierce appeared from the hallway 2 minutes later. He stopped when he saw Ethan. They looked at each other across the lobby. Gerald crossed the room and put his hand out. Ethan shook it. Gerald gripped hard and held it a second longer than a normal handshake, which was the closest Gerald Pierce had ever come to saying anything he couldn't put into words. She's in the second-floor conference room, Gerald said. I'll take you up. I know the way. I know you do. Gerald said it quietly. I'd like to walk you there anyway. They took the elevator. Neither of them spoke. On the second floor, Gerald led him down the corridor to the smaller conference room, not the big one with the glass walls, but the one used for internal meetings, closer quarters, less performance. Gerald knocked twice, opened the door, and stepped back. Victoria Hart was already seated, and she looked different than she had 2 days ago. Not smaller exactly. She wasn't a woman who went small, but something had shifted in her presentation. The absolute control was still there, but it was effortful now in a way it hadn't been before. The kind of control that costs something to maintain. She looked at him when he walked in. She didn't look away. He sat down across from her. Gerald closed the door. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Victoria Hart said, "I owe you an apology." "Yes," Ethan said. "You do." She absorbed that. She had probably been hoping he would say something softer. He wasn't going to. "What I said in that meeting was—" She stopped. "It was wrong. In every possible way. The words I used, the way I—" She stopped again. "There's no version of it that's defensible. I know that." "Did you know who I was before that meeting?" "No." "Did you ask?" A pause. "No." When Tom Hendricks tried to explain, "I shut him down," she said it flat. No qualification. "I saw your uniform, and I made a judgment, and I shut down anyone who tried to complicate that judgment." She met his eyes. "I am aware of exactly what that says about me." Ethan studied her for a long moment. He was trying to find the performance in it, the CEO, managing a situation, the carefully calibrated apology designed to achieve an outcome. He looked for it because he was not a man who trusted easily, and he had particular reason not to trust the people in this building. But he didn't find it. What he found instead was something that surprised him. What he found was a person sitting with genuine shame, not the shame of being caught, but the deeper kind. The kind that comes from recognizing something about yourself that you would rather not have seen. "The documentation that Emily Brooks filed," he said. "I've read it." "All of it?" "Yes." Her voice didn't change, but something moved behind her eyes. "All of it." "And Douglas Hale. He's been placed on administrative leave pending the full investigation." She paused. "The board moved on that last night." Ethan nodded once. "Ethan." She used his first name for the first time, and it landed differently than he expected. Not presumptuous, but careful. Like she was testing whether she'd earned the right to it yet. "I can't fix what's been done to you. I know that. 8 years of I can't go back and undo that. But I want to understand the full scope of it. Not for legal reasons. Not to manage the liability. I want to understand it because I'm responsible for what happens in this company going forward, and I need to know the truth of what this place has been doing." He looked at her. "And I need your help," she said. "Not because you're the only one who can fix the systems, although you might be. Because doing this right matters. And I think you're someone for whom doing things right matters more than almost anything else." He was quiet for a moment. "You got that from a 15-minute meeting." "I got that from the way you put your badge down." She held his gaze. "A man who wanted revenge would have argued. A man who wanted leverage would have threatened. You just left, like you were done trying to make us understand and had accepted that some people have to learn the hard way." He didn't answer right away. "I have conditions," he said. "I expected you would. I'm not an employee. I'll come in as an independent consultant. My rate, my terms, my hours." "Agreed. Every repair, every diagnosis, every solution I provide gets documented under my name. In writing. On the official record." "Agreed. When the internal investigation concludes, I want an independent review of every patent and innovation filing from the past 8 years. Full attribution correction on anything that's mine." Victoria nodded. The board has already authorized that review. I'm not finished. He leaned forward slightly. Every technician, every maintenance worker, every floor-level employee in this facility gets a formal credit and contribution system. Structured. Auditable. If someone solves a problem, their name goes on it. No exceptions. No managers taking credit for what their team built. That's a condition of my coming back, not just for this crisis, but for any future engagement. Victoria was quiet for a moment. He could see her turning it over, not resisting it, genuinely thinking through what it would require. That's a significant operational change, she said. Yes, it is. It's also the right thing to do. Yes, he said. It is. She put her hand across the table. Open. An offer. Those are your terms. I accept them. He looked at her hand. He shook it. Now, he said, standing. I need to get to the Junction 9 manifold. We've got about a 6-hour window before the pressure differential in Line 4 causes a cascade failure that's going to take the whole East production wing offline. Victoria blinked. How long has that window been? Since about 4 this morning. He was already moving toward the door. I'd have been here at 5, but I had to drop my daughter at school. He pulled the door open. Gerald was in the corridor, leaning against the wall with the practiced patience of a man who had waited outside a lot of important rooms. Line 4 manifold, Ethan said. Gerald straightened immediately. Jimmy Reyes is already down there. I told him you might be coming. Good man. He paused, looked back at Gerald. You always were. Gerald Pierce, 20-year security veteran, who had never in his professional life been seen to get emotional in a workplace setting, looked at the floor for a moment. Yeah, well, he said gruffly. Let's go fix the damn building. They went. The floor recognized him before he reached it. He heard it, the subtle shift in the ambient sound of the facility voices carrying differently, the word spreading, the way news spreads on a floor where people actually pay attention. And then he was through the access door and into the working part of the building, and the people who had always actually seen him were there. Jimmy Reyes spotted him from 30 feet away and crossed the floor at something just below a run. He was a compact man in his 40s with grease on his forearms and an expression that was trying to be professional and not quite managing it. I have the manifold room prepped, Jimmy said. I pulled the secondary bypass specs this morning when Hendricks called. I think I know what we're looking for, but I want your eyes on it before I touch anything. Show me. They moved fast. Ethan asked questions as they walked, current pressure readings, timing of the anomalies, what had been tried. Jimmy answered in the shorthand of two people who had worked together long enough to skip the parts that didn't matter. Around them, the floor was operating, reduced, stressed, but operating, and Ethan could feel the attention of the workers nearby, tracking him without being obvious about it. The maintenance crew who had always greeted him every morning, the assembly team who called him by his first name because they'd never had a reason to use anything more formal. The people who knew the way floor-level people always know exactly who had been keeping the lights on. They reached the manifold room at 8:27 a.m. Ethan looked at the pressure readouts, looked at the bypass configuration, asked Jimmy for the maintenance log going back to August, spent 4 minutes reading it. Okay, he said. He took off his jacket, hung it on the wall hook, and rolled up his sleeves. He picked up the first tool, looked at Jimmy. Ready? Been ready, Jimmy said. Then let's go. They worked. Ethan moved through the repair with the focused efficiency of a man who has done a thing so many times that it has become part of him. Not habit exactly, something deeper than habit, the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands. Jimmy matched his rhythm. They didn't talk much while they worked. They didn't need to. An hour in, Ethan found the secondary fracture point he'd been looking for. It was exactly where he'd calculated it would be, and finding it was not a surprise to him, but finding it was the difference between a system that held and a system that failed. He and Jimmy spent 40 minutes on the repair at that single point, working with the precision the situation required. At the 2-hour mark, Emily Brooks appeared at the door. She had her notebook and her wire-rimmed glasses and the expression of someone who has been awake for too long and is running on the particular fuel that comes from knowing something important is happening. "The board is convening at 2 o'clock, she said. "Full session. Douglas Hale's legal team filed a response to the documentation this morning." Ethan didn't look up from what he was doing. "What kind of response?" "Denial. They're claiming the attribution errors were administrative mistakes, clerical issues." He turned a fitting a quarter turn, checked the gauge. "How many of those administrative mistakes are there?" 47 documented instances across 8 years. He handed Jimmy a different wrench. 47 clerical mistakes that all went the same direction. That's what the compliance office noted in their preliminary response. Emily paused. "Also, Catherine Voss from Meridian called the chairman this morning, before the board session. She indicated that the Meridian Group's decision on the contract would be substantially influenced by," she checked her notebook, "the demonstrated competency and integrity of the facility's technical leadership going forward." Ethan checked the primary pressure valve. The reading was improving. Slowly but improving. "Did she say anything else?" "She said," Emily paused, reading carefully, "that in 31 years, she had never seen a maintenance technician present a failure analysis at the level you did in that meeting. And that the Meridian Group does not place $43 million contracts with companies that can't identify and properly recognize the people keeping their systems running." Jimmy Reyes made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something less casual. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He checked the secondary bypass, checked the gauge again. The reading was better. "She said that," he said. "She did." He handed Jimmy the torque wrench. "Hold this steady at 22. He reached past him and made an adjustment to the primary line. The gauge moved. Held. Moved again. And then with a sound that was barely audible, a low definitive settling, the system stabilized. The pressure reading locked in at nominal. Jimmy Reyes exhaled so hard it was almost a laugh. "There it is." "There it is," Ethan agreed quietly. "Now." He stepped back, looked at the system, looked at the readings across the board, all of them pulling toward normal, now the cascade effect, reversing, as the root problem resolved, the downstream lines responding. He rolled his sleeves back down. He thought about 47 instances. He thought about 8 years. He thought about every early morning and late night and Saturday phone call, every problem solved and crisis averted and system saved every time he had made this building work and walked away without his name on any of it. He thought about the way Douglas Hale had shaken his hand on the day the board approved the junction system patent, the way he'd smiled, the way he'd said, "We make a good team, Ethan." Something moved through him. It passed. "Jimmy," he said. "Yeah, good work today." Jimmy looked at him. He had been with the company for 16 years, and in 16 years, Ethan Carter had given him that specific acknowledgement. Not thanks, not casual "good job," but the precise phrase, "good work," with all the weight it carried perhaps 8 or 9 times. Each one of those times, Jimmy had gone home and told his wife about it. "You too," Jimmy said. "Good to have you back." Ethan put on his jacket. He had 3 hours before the board meeting. He had a lot to think about. But for the moment, standing in the manifold room with the pressure gauges reading nominal and the system doing what it was supposed to do, he let himself feel the one thing he almost never allowed himself when the work was done. Satisfaction. Clean, uncomplicated, and entirely his own. He had exactly 90 minutes before the board meeting, and he used every one of them. Not to prepare remarks, not to rehearse anything. Ethan Carter had never been a man who rehearsed because the truth didn't require rehearsal. It just required the courage to say it out loud in the right room at the right time. What he used the 90 minutes for was documentation. He sat in the small break room on the second floor, with his laptop and his 11 years of personal maintenance files, and he built the clearest, most precise account he was capable of building. Every system he had repaired beyond his job description. Every crisis he had averted. Every solution he had designed that had ended up in someone else's patent filing. He cross-referenced dates, work orders, his own personal logs against the official company record. The gap between these two documents was staggering. Emily Brooks knocked on the break room door at 1:45 and looked at his screen and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The board wants you in the room." "I know." Douglas Hale's attorney is going to be on the phone. They're presenting their formal response to the compliance filing. "I know that too." She studied him. "Are you ready?" He saved the document closed. The laptop stood up. "Yes." The boardroom on the executive floor was different from conference room B. Smaller, more serious. No glass walls for the rest of the building to look through. A round table instead of a long one. Richard Alderman's choice. Ethan would later learn a deliberate decision to put everyone on equal visual footing. Around it sat 6 board members, Victoria Hart, the company's general counsel, Emily Brooks, and Tom Hendricks, who had not been planning to attend, but who Alderman had specifically requested because he wanted someone in the room who could verify technical claims in real time. Hendricks looked at Ethan when he walked in. The look said several things simultaneously. It said, "I'm sorry, and I should have pushed harder, and I didn't know the full scope of it, and thank God you're here." Ethan gave him a small nod that answered all of it, and took the empty seat beside him. Richard Alderman opened without preamble. He was in his late 60s, the kind of man who had spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of people, and had developed through that long practice an almost clinical clarity of expression. "We're here to address 3 concurrent matters," he said. "The production crisis status, the Meridian contract situation, and the compliance investigation into attribution irregularities going back to 2017. We'll take them in order." Victoria spoke first on the production crisis. She was crisp, factual, no spin. Line 4 restored to full operation as of 10:53 that morning. Line 7 at 94% and climbing. The cascade risk to the East production wing had been eliminated. The Meridian component rework protocol had been drafted and was awaiting authorization. She paused at the end and said, "All of this was resolved by Ethan Carter, working with Jimmy Reyes on the floor. I want that on the record explicitly." One of the board members, a heavy-set man named Warren Cole, who had been with the board for 14 years and who Ethan had never met, looked at Ethan across the table with an expression Ethan couldn't immediately classify. "How long would it have taken our existing engineering team to reach the same resolution?" he asked. Hendricks answered before Ethan could. "Conservatively, another 4 to 6 days, if they found the right failure point at all without guidance." He paused. "The Junction 9 manifold issue was not in any of our diagnostic protocols, because it was never formally documented as a known risk." "Why not?" Hendricks looked at his hands. "Because the person who identified it and managed it informally was never asked to submit it through formal channels. And because we—" He stopped. Restarted. "Because we weren't looking at the right people when we were looking for expertise." The room absorbed that. Alderman moved to the Meridian situation. Catherine Voss had sent a formal letter that morning. The general counsel read the relevant section aloud. Ethan listened to the words "Meridian's continued partnership contingent upon demonstrated resolution of technical concerns and satisfactory evidence of systemic competency review," and heard, underneath them, the specific thing Catherine had said to him in the coffee shop. She was giving the company a path forward. She was also making sure that path ran directly through acknowledging what Ethan had identified and what the company had nearly failed to address. "She's giving us a lifeline," Warren Cole said bluntly. "She's giving Ethan Carter credit for saving a $43 million contract." Alderman replied with equal bluntness, "Which is accurate." "Why?" Then the attorney's voice came through the conference room speaker. Douglas Hale's legal representation, a firm out of Chicago that Ethan had never heard of, but that the general counsel clearly recognized by the careful way she straightened in her chair. The attorney's name was Garrison. He spoke for 11 minutes. The core argument was what Emily had described: administrative error. Systemic clerical failures in the attribution process. No intent, no pattern. Regrettable, but not actionable. Nobody spoke while Garrison made his case. Ethan sat with his hands flat on the table and his face entirely still, and he listened to 47 instances of taking everything he'd built described as paperwork mistakes, and he felt something in his chest go very quiet and very cold. When Garrison finished, Alderman said, "Thank you, Mr. Garrison. We'll note the response." And then he looked at Ethan. "Mr. Carter, do you have anything you'd like to add to the record?" Ethan opened his laptop. He turned it so the screen faced the center of the table. "I have documentation covering 114 instances from 2015 to the present," he said. "Work orders, personal maintenance logs, time-stamped emails, and in several cases, text message records establishing my direct involvement in solutions attributed in official company records to other individuals. 47 of those are already in the compliance filing Emily Brooks submitted. The remaining 67 are new." He paused. "I can provide this to the board's legal team by end of day." The silence that followed had a specific quality. It was the silence of a room full of people recalibrating simultaneously. Garrison's voice came through the speaker slightly less measured than before. "Those records haven't been verified. They're my personal records," Ethan said. "The verification process would involve cross-referencing them against the company's own system logs and access records. If you'd like to do that, I'd welcome it. Every one of those logs will show my access credentials at the relevant times and locations." Another silence. Longer. 114. Warren Cole said quietly, as though saying the number out loud might change its size. It didn't. "Over 11 years, Ethan said. "Yes." Across the table, the board member to Alderman's left, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had barely spoken since Ethan entered the room, put down the pen she'd been holding and looked at him with the expression of someone who has just finished calculating a sum and arrived at a number that requires her to sit with it for a moment. "Mr. Carter," she said carefully, "in your estimation, and I understand this is an estimate, what is the total value of the intellectual contributions represented in those 114 instances?" Yeah, he had thought about this. He had done the math conservatively 3 different ways. Based on documented cost savings contract values, tied to specific innovations, and the patent valuations on file, somewhere between $14 and $18 million. The room went very still. Someone's pen clicked. That was the only sound. Then Garrison's voice, very carefully. "Those figures are speculative. Mr. Garrison." Alderman's voice was quiet, but it cut through the speaker like a blade. "I'll ask you to hold your comments until the board has finished its review of the documentation." A pause. "Thank you." Ethan watched the board members look at each other across the round table. He watched the specific choreography of people absorbing a truth that was larger than they had prepared for. Warren Cole was doing the kind of very still, very focused thing that large men do when they are genuinely shaken and are working hard not to show it. Patricia Osei had picked her pen back up and was writing something with the focused intensity of someone who needed to put words on paper to believe them. Alderman was looking at the laptop screen as though he could read the weight of every entry from where he sat. Tom Hendricks was looking at his hands again. Ethan understood that look now. It wasn't guilt exactly, or not only guilt. It was the specific heaviness of a decent man who had known on some level that something was wrong and had told himself it was beyond his reach to correct, and was now sitting with the cost of that choice. Hendricks had never taken credit for Ethan's work, but he had watched Douglas Hale do it and said nothing. And in the economy of what had been done to Ethan Carter, saying nothing was its own kind of choice. Ethan did not hate him for it. He understood it too well. The board recessed for 20 minutes. Ethan went to the hallway. stood there. Gerald appeared from somewhere. Gerald always appeared from somewhere when things were happening, a talent Ethan had always respected, and handed him a cup of coffee without being asked. "How's it going in there?" "It's going," Ethan said. "Douglas know about the 114. His attorney does now." Gerald made a sound that was not quite a word. Then, "You know he's been calling me all morning. Douglas?" "What's he saying?" "Ethan." It was complicated. "Ethan, you have to understand the pressure I was under, Ethan. I always planned to—" Gerald stopped. "You know, that kind of thing." Ethan drank his coffee. "You going to talk to him?" Gerald asked. "Not today." Gerald nodded. "Fair enough." The door opened and Emily appeared. "They're ready." When Ethan walked back in the room, felt different. The recalibration was complete. He could feel it in the way people held themselves. The board had gone in 20 minutes from managing a situation to understanding its full dimensions, and those were two entirely different postures. "Chin," Alderman spoke. "The board has reviewed the preliminary documentation, and we are expanding the compliance investigation to cover all 114 instances. We are also directing the legal team to initiate a full intellectual property review with the goal of correcting attribution on all affected filings." He looked at Ethan directly. "Mr. Carter, the board owes you an unambiguous statement of accountability. What happened in this company over the past 8+ years? The systematic failure to recognize your contributions, the misattribution of your work, and the conditions that allowed that to continue. Those are failures of governance and culture that occurred on this board's watch. We are responsible for them. I am sorry." Nay, he said it the way someone says something they have thought carefully about and mean without reservation. Not a performance. Not liability management. An apology. Ethan nodded once. He didn't say it was all right because it wasn't. He didn't say he appreciated it because that felt insufficient. He just nodded, and Alderman seemed to understand that the nod was the right response and accepted it. Then Warren Cole leaned forward. "I want to discuss going forward," he said. "Specifically, Mr. Carter's role going forward." He looked around the table. "What I've heard today, the production crisis resolution, the Meridian situation, the scope of the technical contributions is not consistent with a consulting arrangement. It's consistent with a leadership role." Victoria Hart said, "I agree." Ethan looked at her. "What are you proposing?" She had clearly thought about this carefully. She spoke without hesitation. "Director of Engineering Operations, full executive level, oversight of all technical systems, maintenance production engineering, and the formal contribution documentation system we discussed this morning." She paused. "With a seat at the leadership table, which means your voice is in the room before decisions are made, not called in after." The room waited. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. He thought about the job boards he had pulled up at his kitchen table 2 days ago. He thought about Conference Room B and the way every eye had turned toward him. He thought about the badge making that small sound when it hit the table. "I have conditions beyond what we discussed this morning," he said. "Name them." "The contribution documentation system applies retroactively. Anyone in this facility who can demonstrate unrecognized work gets a fair review. Not just my cases." Victoria nodded. "Agreed." "The investigation into Douglas Hale proceeds to its full conclusion, regardless of what settlement his legal team proposes. It goes on the record." "Agreed. And I want Jimmy Reyes promoted. He's been at the technician level for 16 years, and he's the best systems operator in this building. That changes immediately." A brief silence. Not resistance consideration. "What role?" Victoria asked. "Senior systems engineer. His credentials are non-traditional, same as mine. That stops being the reason people don't get recognized." He held her gaze. "That's the whole point of everything that's changing here, isn't it?" Victoria looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Alderman. Alderman looked at the board. No one objected. "Done," Victoria said. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, Ethan was not a man for dramatic moments, but something real and substantial settled into place the way a system settles when a repair is done correctly, and the pressure equalizes, and everything begins running the way it was always supposed to run. Garrison's voice came through the speaker one more time. "The board should be aware that Mr. Hale intends to—" "Mr. Garrison," Alderman said with the patience of a man who is very finished with a conversation. "Your client is on administrative leave pending a full investigation. If he has proposals, he can submit them in writing to the General Counsel's office." A pause. "This call is concluded." The speaker went quiet. And then, Tom Hendricks did something that Ethan would later have difficulty describing to anyone who asked. He didn't make a speech. He didn't stand up or reach across the table. He just looked at Ethan with that look, the one carrying 11 years of mournings and a particular kind of belated understanding, and said very quietly, "I should have said something a long time ago." Ethan could have let it go. He could have nodded the way he'd nodded at Alderman and moved forward. But Hendricks was looking at him with the rawness of a man who needed to hear something true and not just comfortable, and Ethan respected him enough to tell the truth. "Yes," he said. "You should have." Hendricks absorbed it. He nodded. "I know." "But you're here now," Ethan said. "That matters." Hendricks exhaled. "Thank you." The meeting concluded at 3:47 p.m. People filed out. The General Counsel had Ethan's documentation copied and filed and was already on the phone with the compliance office before she cleared the door. Patricia Osei stopped on her way out and looked at him and said simply, "Welcome to the table, Mr. Carter," and walked on. Ethan stood at the round table for a moment after most people had gone. He looked at the room. He thought about the other room, the bigger one with the glass walls 2 floors down, and about standing at that schematic with every executive in the building, watching and trying to say something true, and being told in the sharpest possible terms that he didn't belong there. 2 days, that's all it had taken. 2 days for the truth to do what he hadn't been able to do in 11 years, make itself impossible to ignore. He picked up his laptop. His phone showed 3 missed calls from Carol, which meant Sophie had been dropped off and was probably eating Carol's good cookies and asking questions about the universe. He'd call on the way to pick her up. He had one more thing to do first. Douglas Hale's office was on the 2nd floor at the end of the engineering wing corridor. It was a real office walls, a door that closed his name on a plaque that had been there for 6 years. Ethan had walked past it thousands of times. He stopped in front of it now. The nameplate was still there. The light inside the office was off. Douglas Hale was not here, had not been here since the administrative leave notification reached him that morning. Ethan looked at the nameplate for a long moment. He thought about the handshake, the smiled. "We make a good team, Ethan." He thought about every meeting where Douglas had stood up and presented a solution and used the word "I" when the correct word was "he." He thought about the Saturday phone calls and the 4:30 mornings and every problem he had solved that had become someone else's credential. He felt the anger then. He let himself feel it fully without managing it, without the long-practiced compression that had kept it contained for years. He stood in a quiet corridor, and he let it move through him like a current. It passed. Now, he was not going to carry it any further than this hallway. He had decided that. Whatever came of the investigation, whatever the legal process produced, whatever accountability eventually arrived for Douglas Hale, that was no longer his to carry. He had put it down. He walked back to the elevator. He called Carol from the parking lot. Sophie answered on the 2nd ring, with a mouth clearly full of something, and said, "Dad, are you done with work stuff?" "Yeah, Bug, I'm done." "Can we have spaghetti?" "We had spaghetti 2 days ago." "It doesn't have a frequency requirement," she said with an air of absolute authority that was so precisely her mother's that Ethan had to lean against his truck for a moment and just breathe. 20 minutes, he said. "Okay." A pause. "Dad." "Yeah." You sound different." He looked up at the sky above the parking lot. Clouds moving fast. Cold October light. "Different how?" "Like when you hum," she said simply. And then because she was Sophie. "See you in 20 minutes." He got in the truck. He sat there for just a moment before starting it. 114 instances. $14 to $18 million. 11 years. He let those numbers exist in the air around him for exactly as long as they needed to, and then he set them down the same way he had set down his badge 2 days ago, deliberately, finally, like closing a book he had read 100 times. He started the truck. He pulled out of the parking lot and merged into traffic and headed toward Carol's place. And on the way, he felt something he hadn't felt in so long that it took him a full mile to identify it. He felt light. Not happy exactly, too much had happened for simple happiness, and some of what had happened would take a long time to fully settle. But light. The specific lightness of a man who has been carrying something for years and has finally set it down in a place where other people can see it too. He turned up the radio. A song he liked was on. He drove through the city with the windows cracked and the October air moving through the cab, and for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Carter did not have anything left to prove to anyone. He just had to go pick up his daughter. The next morning he showed up at the facility at 7:45. He came through this front entrance again. The receptionist recognized him this time and smiled. He took the elevator to the second floor, which he had never done before in 11 years because there had never been a reason. He walked down the corridor to the corner office that HR had sent him directions to via email at 11 the previous night. His name was not on the door yet. That would take a few days. He opened it anyway. He set his laptop on the desk. He set his coffee mug with the chipped handle beside it. He opened the laptop, pulled up the blank template for what would become the new contribution documentation system, and started building it from scratch. He had been working for about 20 minutes when someone knocked on the open door. He looked up. Jimmy Reyes was standing there in his work clothes with an expression that was trying to be casual and was nowhere close. In his hand was a folded piece of paper that Ethan recognized as an HR notification letter. "They're saying senior systems engineer," Jimmy said. "Starting today." "That's right." Jimmy looked at the letter, then at Ethan. "You did this." "You earned it. I just said it out loud." Jimmy folded the letter carefully and put it in his chest pocket. He stood there for a moment, and Ethan could see him working through something. When Jimmy spoke, his voice was under tighter control than usual. "My wife cried," he said. "When I told her, she cried." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Tell her it's long overdue." "Yeah." Jimmy cleared his throat. "Yeah, I will." He knocked the door frame twice the way the guys on the floor knocked on things as a kind of punctuation when words ran out. "Line 7 is at full spec this morning." "I know. I checked the remote readings at 6. A short laugh. "Of course you did." He turned to go, stopped. "Ethan." "Jimmy." "Thank you." Ethan looked at him. "Go do the work," he said. "That's the thanks." Jimmy went. Ethan turned back to his laptop. Outside his office, the facility was coming online, the sounds of the morning shift arriving, the system spinning up the ordinary productive noise of 800 people starting a workday. A workday that existed in part because a man in worn-out boots had set down his badge on a table 2 days ago and said 7 words that had somehow managed to change everything. He worked. No. That was the thing about Ethan Carter. At the end of the day, at the beginning of the day, at every point in between, he just worked. Not for credit, not for recognition, not to prove anything to anyone. He worked because the problems were real and the solutions were findable, and people's livelihoods depended on the systems running right. The difference now was that everyone knew it. His phone buzzed at 9:03, text from Sophie, which meant she had borrowed Carol's phone, which meant she had something important to say. "Did they make you the boss yet?" He smiled at the screen, typed back, "Working on it." 3 dots. Then good. "You were always the boss. They just didn't know." He set the phone face down on the desk, looked at the blank template on his screen, started typing. The contribution documentation system needed a name. He thought about it for a moment. Then he typed in the header field, 3 simple words. "The work matters." He looked at it, kept it, and went back to building something that would outlast every wrong that had been done to him. Something that would make sure going forward that no one in this building would ever again do their best work in the dark. The contribution documentation system went live on a Monday morning, 6 weeks after Ethan Carter walked back through the front entrance of the building he had spent 11 years keeping alive from the inside out. 6 weeks. That's how long it took to build something that should have existed from the beginning. But he had not built it alone. Emily Brooks had co-architected the framework, working alongside him in the evenings after the main workday. Ended the 2 of them at the round table in the small conference room, with cold coffee and open laptops, arguing productively about structure and language, and exactly how to make a system that was genuinely fair rather than just administratively compliant. Jimmy Reyes had contributed the floor-level logic, the practical reality of how technicians actually documented their work, what they would actually use versus what would become another ignored form. Tom Hendricks had reviewed the technical attribution standards 3 times and offered corrections that were precise and genuinely useful, and that he offered with a humility that Ethan accepted without comment, because a man doing right going forward didn't need to be made to grovel for what he'd failed to do before. The system was named exactly what Ethan had typed in that first morning. The work matters. A simple name. An unarguable one. On the morning it launched, Ethan sent a company-wide email. Not a long one. He had never been a man who used more words than necessary. It said, "Starting today, every contribution to this facility, every repair, every solution, every improvement, gets documented under the name of the person who did the work. This is not optional, and it is not administrative. It is the foundation of how this company will operate going forward. If you have questions, my door is open." No. By 10 o'clock he had 47 replies. Most of them were from the floor. From maintenance crews and assembly technicians and line operators who had spent years doing work that disappeared upward into other people's reports. The replies were not formal. Some of them were barely grammatical. Several contained only 2 or 3 words. But Ethan read every single one because every single one was a person who had been waiting, not necessarily knowing they were waiting, but waiting for someone to say out loud that their work was real and it mattered and it would be seen. Monsieur. One reply was from a woman named Rosa Gutierrez, a 23-year assembly technician who had been with the company since she was 19. She had written 3 sentences. She said, "I fixed the calibration error on line 3 back in September by myself because my supervisor wasn't available and I didn't know if I was allowed to. It took me 4 hours. Nobody ever knew. Under the work matters, that fix had a home now." Ethan wrote her name into the system himself and backdated it to September with a note explaining the circumstances. He found 9 more cases like Rosa's in the first week alone. At 2:15 on the Wednesday of that first week, Douglas Hale's legal team formally withdrew their clerical error defense. Ethan found out from Emily, who appeared at his office door with the particular expression of someone delivering news they have been anticipating for a long time. She set a 1-page summary on his desk and said, "They settled, or they're starting to. The full terms are still being negotiated, but the core argument is gone. They're not contesting the attribution findings." Ethan read the summary, set it down. What does that mean for the patent corrections? It means they proceed without legal challenge. 47 patents and design filings go through the full reattribution review. The company's IP counsel says the process will take 3 to 4 months, but the outcome is it's not in question anymore. She paused. "Your name goes back on everything." He nodded. "How do you feel?" she asked, and the question was genuine, not small talk, not professional courtesy, but the real question of someone who had spent 6 weeks watching this process and had a real stake in the answer. Ethan thought about it honestly. Like it's the right outcome, he said. Not like it fixes what it cost. He paused. Both of those things are true at the same time. Emily nodded. She understood that. The financial review is separate, she said. The board's legal team says the compensation discussion will... I know. He picked up his coffee. One thing at a time. She smiled slightly. That's what you always say. Because it's always right. She left him to his work. The financial conversation happened the following Thursday. Alderman conducted it personally, which Ethan had not expected, and which told him something about how seriously the board was treating the accountability piece. They sat in the round boardroom again, just the two of them this time, and the general counsel and Ethan's own attorney, a sharp, quiet woman named Patricia Dyer, who had been recommended by Catherine Voss, and who had reviewed every document in Ethan's personal files with an attention to detail that had impressed him considerably. The number on the table was substantial. Back compensation, intellectual property licensing, corrected equity participation in the patents that had generated ongoing revenue. Ethan had seen the preliminary calculation and had gone very still when he read it. Not because it was more than he had expected, he had done his own math, but because seeing it written down in formal legal language, made real in a way that nothing else had quite managed the full scope of what had been taken from him. Patricia Dyer negotiated with quiet precision for 2 hours. Ethan spoke only 4 times, and each time he spoke, it was to clarify a technical point about which specific innovations had generated, which specific returns, information that only he possessed, and that no legal team on either side could have supplied. Each time he spoke, Alderman made a note, and the general counsel adjusted a figure. The settlement they reached was not public. It would not become public. Ethan had specifically requested that not to protect Douglas Hale or the company, but because Ethan Carter had never done his best work for an audience and was not going to start now. The resolution of this particular injustice was between the people who had been in the room when it happened. That was enough. He shook Alderman's hand at the end of the meeting and walked out into the corridor and stood there for a moment with Patricia Dyer beside him. "How are you doing?" she asked. "I think," he said carefully, "that I'm going to need a few days to process this." She looked at him. "Take them." He took a half day. He went to Sophie's school and picked her up 2 hours early, which he had never done before, and when the office called Sophie out of her classroom and Sophie appeared in the doorway and saw him standing there, she stopped completely. "Did something happen?" "Something good," he said. She studied him with those gray eyes for a moment. Then she grabbed her backpack from the hook by the door. "Can we go to the park?" "Yeah, Bug. We can go to the park." They spent 2 hours at the park. Sophie ran. She climbed things she was technically not supposed to climb. She talked extensively about her current best friend, and about the book they were reading in class, and about a disagreement she'd had with a boy named Tyler over whether dinosaurs could have survived if the asteroid had been smaller, a topic on which she had very firm opinions. Ethan sat on a bench and drank bad vending machine coffee and watched his daughter move through the world with the particular fearless confidence of a person who has never once doubted her right to take up space in it. He thought her mother would have loved this day. He let himself think that fully without pulling back from it the way he sometimes did when the grief still had edges. He let it sit in him and move through him and settle. 7 years since he'd lost her. 7 years of 4:30 mornings and school pickups and spaghetti twice a week, and building a life out of what remained when the most important person in it was gone. He thought about what remained. Sophie ran past him and yelled something about Tyler being wrong about the asteroid, and he called after her that she was probably right, and she shouted back obviously, and kept running. What remained? He thought about that. 11 years of work that had mattered even when nobody saw it. A daughter who could read people the way other people read weather. A settlement that would mean Sophie could go to any college she chose without a single financial worry. A system with his name on it. The work matters that was already changing how 800 people were seen and recognized in the building where he'd spent a decade being invisible. Jimmy Reyes going home to a wife who had cried with relief. Rosa Gutierrez's 4 hours of invisible work finally written down in the right place under the right name. That was what remained. He drove Sophie home. Made spaghetti. He'd stopped pretending the frequency bothered him, and they ate together at the kitchen table, the way they always did. And Sophie told him she'd decided dinosaurs definitely would have survived. And he said he thought she was probably right. And she said she was going to write a report about it, even though nobody had asked her to, and he said that sounded exactly right. After Sophie was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and opened the formal letter from the board that had arrived that afternoon, his official appointment as Director of Engineering Operations, with a start date, a full job description, and at the bottom, a paragraph he had requested be included in every executive appointment letter going forward. He read it slowly. It said this role carries the responsibility of ensuring that every person in this organization, regardless of title, position, or educational background, receives full and documented recognition for the work they contribute. This is not aspirational. It is operational. It is the standard by which leadership in this company will be evaluated. He had written that paragraph himself. The board had approved it without a single revision. He closed the laptop. He sat in the quiet of his kitchen, and he thought about Conference Room B, and the badge making that small sound, and the 7 words he had said on his way out the door. He had meant them as a statement of fact. He had not meant them as a threat, or a performance, or the opening move in a battle. He had simply said what was true, that the company would have to manage without him, and then he had left, because a man who means something doesn't stay in the room trying to convince people to believe him. He had not expected what followed, or he had in the way that you know a thing is structurally certain, without knowing exactly when it will arrive. He had known that the truth of what he'd built would eventually become impossible for the building to function without. He had not known it would take 48 hours. He had not known about Emily Brooks working through the night with her wire-rimmed glasses and her 41 hours of wakefulness, building a case from documents that should have been corrected years ago. He had not known that Catherine Voss would make a note on a legal pad and decide to find out who he was. He had not known that the specific cascade of Line 4 would reach the point of crisis at precisely the moment when the Meridian contract was most vulnerable, creating a pressure that left the company no room to pretend the problem was anything other than what it was. He had not known any of that. He had just told the truth and walked out and gone home and made spaghetti. He thought about what Sophie had said on his behalf when she thought he wasn't listening when she was on the phone with Carol the night after it all started. Her small voice in the next room, saying with complete seriousness, "My dad is really good at his job, and they're going to figure that out." She had been 7 years old, and she had been completely right. The day the Douglas Hale investigation formally concluded was a Thursday in late November. Ethan heard about it from Emily in the morning, the way he heard about most administrative conclusions. Now a quick message, a short summary of the facts without elaboration. Hale had accepted a negotiated separation. The financial penalties were tied to the IP settlement. He would not be returning to the industry in any technical leadership capacity, a condition that the Meridian Group had specifically requested, and that the board had agreed to without hesitation. Ethan read the summary. Replied to Emily, "Thank you for everything you did to bring this to light." She replied immediately, "You built the proof. I just made sure it got into the right hands." He sat with that for a moment, and then wrote back, "That's not a small thing." She wrote, "No, it isn't." He put his phone down and went back to work. Tom Hendricks knocked on his door at lunch that day. He was carrying 2 sandwiches from the place down the street, the one with the good turkey on sourdough that Ethan had been eating at his workbench in the maintenance bay for years. Hendricks set one on the desk and sat down across from him. "Hale's gone," Hendricks said. "I heard." Hendricks unwrapped his sandwich. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for 6 weeks. Every version I come up with sounds insufficient." Ethan picked up his own sandwich. Then don't figure it out. Just eat lunch. Hendricks looked at him. Something in his face loosened slightly. Yeah, okay. They ate. They talked about Line 7's performance metrics and the Meridian component rework timeline, which was on track and under budget, and about a new hire in the structural engineering division who Hendricks thought showed genuine promise and who Ethan had already noticed for the same reasons. They talked about the contribution system and a question that had come up about retroactive documentation for contract workers who weren't on the full employee record. Ethan had thoughts about that. Hendricks had different thoughts. They disagreed productively for about 15 minutes and arrived somewhere better than either had started. It was, Ethan thought, a regular lunch between two people who worked together. That was exactly what it was and exactly what it should be. When Hendricks stood to go, he paused at the door. Ethan? He said the name the way people sometimes say a name when the name is carrying more than one thing. I'm glad you came back. Ethan looked at him. Me too, Tom. Hendricks left. 3 weeks before Christmas, the Meridian contract was signed. Catherine Voss came to the facility in person for the signing. She sat across from Victoria Hart at the round table, and she signed her name to $43 million of work that would keep 800 people employed for the next 4 years. And when she stood up and shook hands around the table, she came to Ethan last. She shook his hand and held it a moment longer than necessary. You should know, she said quietly, that you were the reason we came back to the table. The work was the reason, he said. She looked at him. She had been in this industry for 31 years, and she understood something about the difference between men who needed to be seen and men who needed the work to be right. She recognized which kind she was looking at. Yes, she agreed. The work. She released his hand. Don't let them forget that. I won't, he said. That's actually my job now. She smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and it changed her face considerably. Good, she said. Mum. The Christmas party that year was different from any the company had held before. Ethan had not specifically requested the change in format, but someone had taken note of the fact that the new director of engineering operations held his office door open every morning, ate lunch in the break room with the floor staff twice a week, and had personally attended every team meeting in every department in his first 2 months, not to direct or evaluate, but to listen. And so the party that year did not divide itself along the old invisible lines, the executives gravitating to one side of the room and the floor workers to the other. It was just a room full of people who worked in the same building and who were for one evening simply in the same place together. Jimmy Reyes found him near the coffee station halfway through the evening. He was with his wife, a compact, energetic woman named Diane, who shook Ethan's hand with both of hers and said before he could say anything, You changed our life. I want you to know I say that understanding exactly what I mean. Ethan looked at her. He thought about the right thing to say and found that it was a short thing. Jimmy earned it. I just said it loud enough for the right people to hear. Diane shook her head. That's the whole job, isn't it? Making sure the right people hear the right things. She looked at her husband. He's been coming home differently since October. I don't know how else to say it. He comes home like a man who knows what he did today was seen. Ethan was quiet for a moment. That sentence landed somewhere deep and stayed there. That's what it should always have been, he said. Yeah. He drove home that night thinking about Diane's words. He comes home like a man who knows what he did today was seen. He turned it over during the whole drive, the way he turned over engineering problems, looking at it from different angles, testing its weight. He got home paid. The babysitter checked on Sophie asleep, her small hand open on the pillow, that particular absolute peace that children have when they're fully under, and then stood in the kitchen in the quiet. He picked up his phone, opened his messages, scrolled back past the dozens of work threads and the texts from Carol and the brief exchanges with Emily and Hendricks all the way back to a message from 6 weeks ago that he'd never deleted. Douglas Hale's text. It's Douglas. I know what's happening. I need to talk to you before tomorrow. Please. He had never replied. He looked at it for a long moment. He thought about replying now. He drafted 3 versions in his head. Then he set the phone down. Some things did not require resolution. Some things required only that you understood them clearly and did not let them follow you into the next morning. He was not going to carry Douglas Hale one step further than this kitchen. He set the phone face down on the counter. He thought about the year. The 47 mornings between losing his wife and learning to make pancakes that Sophie would actually eat. The 11 years of 4:30 mornings and invisible work and the specific weight of knowing your own value in a building full of people who didn't. The 2 days that had cracked everything open. The 6 weeks of building something new. He thought about a 7-year-old girl who had said with complete calm, "They're going to figure that out." He went to Sophie's room, stood in the doorway. She was exactly as he'd left her, hand open, completely still, that absolute peace. He thought about the little crayon drawing on the refrigerator, him and her in front of the house with the enormous yellow sun. He had looked at it on the worst morning of those 2 days, and it had steadied him. Not because it solved anything, because it was true, because it showed exactly what was real, and what mattered, and what was worth protecting. He was worth protecting. His work was worth protecting. The people who came to work every day in worn boots and faded uniforms and did the real labor that kept everything running, they were worth protecting. That was not a lesson he had needed to learn. It was a lesson he had always known. What changed was that now he was in a position to teach it to the people who hadn't known it yet. He went to his own room. He did not lie awake. He did not run systems in his head, or map problem edges, or hold vigil over things unresolved. He had done that for years in this bed, in this dark, with the weight of invisible work and uncredited solutions, and the quiet loneliness of a man whose best efforts always seemed to belong to someone else by morning. He lay down. He slept. And in the morning he made breakfast. Sophie came padding out in her socks and sat at the kitchen table and ate her eggs and asked him several questions about whether robots would ever actually think the way people think. And he told her that was one of the most genuinely interesting questions in the world right now. And she said she knew and had another question ready before he'd finished the sentence. He dropped her at school at 7:40. She hopped out of the truck and ran toward the door, and then stopped and turned and looked at him through the windshield with those gray eyes that had been reading him accurately since she was old enough to notice that her father sometimes carried things he didn't say out loud. She gave him a thumbs up. Just that. No words. A thumbs up, and then she turned and went through the door, and was gone. He sat in the truck for a moment. Then he drove to work. Came through the front entrance, took the elevator to the 2nd floor, walked down the corridor to the corner office where his name was now on the door. Not a plaque, yet just the printed card from HR that had been there since the first morning, but his name clearly where anyone who looked would see it. He sat down, opened his laptop. The first email in his inbox was from Rosa Gutierrez, the 23-year assembly tech subject line question about the documentation system. He opened it immediately. He typed back the answer. Then he went to work. Not to prove anything, not to show anyone, not to fill the space that someone else's theft had left, or to settle any score, or to make any point about what he was worth. He worked because the work was real, the problems were real, the solutions mattered, and 800 people were coming through those doors every morning counting on the systems to hold. They would hold. Because Ethan Carter was the one watching. And now finally completely, and without any shadow of question, everyone knew it.